Now, our final speaker is James Cogan, who is a member of the Socialist Equality Party and has played a leading role in the fight to free Julian Assange. As many of you would know, he has written extensively on the World Socialist website. He has spoken at rallies, at meetings, and conferences in this vital and international campaign. Please make him very welcome.
Well, just in beginning, I'd like to thank all the other speakers who have certainly presented very clearly the breadth of the political issues that we're here about. I mean, the near decade-long persecution of Julian Assange is the test case for freedom of speech and democratic rights of our time. Its outcome is going to have immense implications for all of the social and democratic rights of the working class, whether in the United States, in Britain, here in Australia, or internationally. Now, we know that there are tens of millions of people now who are following the Assange case and will be following the extradition hearing as it begins on February the 24th in London. Demands are being made for his freedom from every part of the world, including belatedly by some prominent politicians and major human rights and civil liberties organisations. The outpouring of support now taking place for Julian Assange is the product of several interconnected factors. Firstly, as Mags pointed to, the brutal expulsion of Julian from the Ecuadorian embassy last April, his outrageous imprisonment in the maximum security Belmarsh prison, Britain's Guantanamo, and the laying of espionage charges against him by the Trump administration vindicated everything that WikiLeaks and publications such as the World Socialist website had warned about since he was first, the persecution began in 2010. The false allegations of sexual assault levelled against Julian by Swedish prosecutors were always the means to try and undermine his support, slander his name, and create conditions where he could be rendered to the United States. The American ruling class were determined to take revenge upon him for publishing the leaks made by Assange Manning and exposing their criminality. By silencing Assange and WikiLeaks, they intend to intimidate into silence all future would-be whistleblowers and principled journalists. The slanders after 2016 that WikiLeaks was a tool of Trump and Vladimir Putin because it published truthful leaks exposing the right-wing and militarist campaign of Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton were also shameless fabrications. It is the Trump administration that labelled WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service and which is seeking to condemn Assange to a life sentence in the darkest hole of the American federal prison system. The saying goes, a lie can travel around the globe while the truth is putting on its shoes. In the case of Julian Assange, the truth has now put on its shoes. The American, British, Australian, and Swedish governments sought to destroy him solely because WikiLeaks did what the compliant and corrupted corporate media will not do. Fiercely publish whistleblower leaks that alert ordinary people to the truth about the society in which we live. He has been denied his most fundamental rights and, as has been powerfully reviewed today by Liza, subjected to relentless torture to the point where his life is in danger. Assange Manning has been re-imprisoned because with the courage and the principle that has defined her life, she has refused to testify to a grand jury in Virginia against Assange. Now, people everywhere were shocked and horrified by the brutal treatment of Assange following his eviction from the embassy and the re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning. The most decisive factor in the upsurge of support for Assange and Manning, however, is the undeniable, explosive re-entry of the working class into political life around the world. For decades, the class struggle was suppressed. Today, the grotesque level of social inequality, the growing danger of extreme right movements and fascism, and the danger and ever-present wars are propelling tens of millions into struggle in powerful social movements, demanding decent living standards, the protection of their democratic rights, for action on climate change and against militarism. Now, in the eyes of the workers and young people who want far-reaching political and social change, there is no question that Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning are considered heroic symbols of defiance and resistance. We speak to workers in the streets of Australian cities and towns. We speak to striking workers in the United States, to yellow vest demonstrators in France, and to the most oppressed workers in Sri Lanka and India. And we find the same universal support for Assange and Manning. In Germany, where a fascist terrorist carried out a mass murder this week targeting immigrants in the town of Hanau, and where for the first time since World War II, a fascist party, the Alternate for Germany, sits in Parliament, there is mass opposition to the promotion of the extreme right. 2 weeks ago, when the fascist AfD determined the election of the president in the state of Thuringia, it sparked spontaneous demonstrations by tens of thousands across the country. Not surprisingly, there are dozens of committees in defence of Assange across Germany because broad sections of people in that country in particular are aware of the link between the suppression of democratic rights, censorship, and the growing threat of fascism. Now, that is the main reason why politicians and organisations that had maintained a complicit silence for many years on Julian's persecution are now speaking out. They are seeking to prevent the sentiment over Assange and Manning becoming merged with the broader issues propelling the working people into mass social struggle. They want people to believe that somehow or in some way democratic rights can be secured and Assange's freedoms can be secured by appealing to the moral conscience of politicians and governments without a direct political struggle against them. Now, at this rally, we certainly demand that the coalition government of Prime Minister Scott Morrison act immediately to compel the Tory government of Boris Johnson in Britain to reject this extradition application, release Julian immediately with no conditions, and allow him to return to Australia if he chooses to, with guaranteed protection from any US application to Australian authorities. We are no less demanding that the Trump administration end the vindictive imprisonment of Chelsea Manning, restore her freedom, and repudiate the outrageous fines that have been levelled against her to bankrupt her for the rest of her life. But we have no illusions that Morrison or Albanese, Johnson or Trump, or the political elites of any country are going to listen to moral appeals about the injustice of the situation or undergo some type of overnight transformation into passionate defenders of the very democratic rights they're tearing to shreds. The reality is that the determination of the Trump administration and its imperialist allies in the British and Australian ruling classes to railroad Assange into prison is because the US and its allies are conspiring to commit even greater war crimes than those exposed by Manning and WikiLeaks a decade ago. I think all of us here know the persecution of Assange and Manning is part of a far broader censorship of oppositional views. The ramming through of draconian laws to illegalise political dissent and working class struggle. The stoking of nationalism and anti-immigrant racism, and the cultivation of the extreme right and fascist tendencies. The evisceration of democratic rights and the preparations for police state rule are always part of the preparation to suppress popular opposition to war, whether it is the war they are plotting against Iran or the wars they are plotting against nuclear armed powers such as Russia and China. Now, two developments in this country in the last week underscore that this is about war preparations. Firstly, the precedent that has been established by the Australian government's collaboration with the persecution of Assange has well and truly come home. On February the 17th, last Monday, a federal court judge ruled in favour of the government and the Australian Federal Police in the case taken out by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation over the police raids that were carried out on its Sydney offices last June. The ABC lawyers had argued in the court that the raids were unlawful because they violated the implied freedom of political communication in the Australian Constitution. The ABC argued that it had the right to publish leaked evidence of that the Australian military had committed war crimes and atrocities against civilians as part of the US occupation of Afghanistan. That was the ABC's case. They had the right under the implied freedom of speech in the Australian Constitution. The judge threw out the ABC's case. He cited a 1963 precedent in Britain, and I quote, "The public interest in national security necessarily outweighs the public interest in the free flow of information." That is, according to the federal court on February the 17th, 2020, there is no right to freedom of speech in Australia, implied or otherwise, in regard to all matters classified as national security, which includes in particular all issues relating to the alliance with the United States and other powers. A blunt message has been sent by the Morrison government and now the federal court. Any media in this country that publishes whistleblower evidence of Australian war crimes, intelligence operations, or just how close US-Australian military collaboration has become, will become the target of police investigations, raids, charges, and possible imprisonment. ABC journalists face now the possibility of criminal charges for the information they published. Now, secondly, and perhaps more significantly, for those who missed it, because it was banner headlines all through the news, of course, no, it wasn't, the Morrison government, with the full bipartisan support of Labor and its leader Anthony Albanese, announced yesterday that a further $1.1 billion will be spent up until 2027 upgrading the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Tyndall in the Northern Territory. The Australian newspaper reported that the upgrade, quote, signals a more assertive Australia-US posture against China and is, quote, designed to support Code E large aircraft such as US Air Force B-52 strategic bombers. The upgrade to the airbase flows directly from the US Force Posture Agreement signed by the Gillard Labor government with the Obama administration in November 2011, which gave the American military unprecedented access to all Northern Australian airfields and Australian naval bases. That is the same Gillard government, Greens-backed Gillard government, that denounced WikiLeaks for carrying out illegal activity and called for charges against Assange to be pursued. Behind the backs of the Australian population and with no public debate, the Gillard Labor government, followed by the coalition governments, Abbott, then Turnbull, now Morrison, have facilitated Northern Australia being turned into a permanent base of operations for American long-range bombers, not only B-52s, but B-1 stealth, that carry nuclear payloads and can murder millions in a war with China. The hostility of successive Labor and coalition governments toward Assange stems from their mutual commitment to the US-Australia military alliance and their alignment with the US preparations for what would be a catastrophic military conflict with China. The dominant sections of Australian banks and finance and big business are tied to Wall Street and their American counterparts by 1,000 threads. Now, we consider the contempt of the coalition and Labor for the anti-war sentiment of the population and for the rights of Julian Assange to be no different to their indifference and contempt for the lives of millions of people due to the impact of global warming, which was demonstrated so starkly over recent months as fires raged across much of this continent. Under successive Labor and coalition governments, the corporate and political elite were repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, warned that climate change would vastly heighten the dangers of catastrophic fires. Climate change does not cause fires, climate change dramatically heightens the danger of those fires. The establishment media knew, the ruling class knew, but the warnings were censored and ignored because to take any action would have affected significant corporate profits. The result is that thousands of people have lost their homes, dozens lost their lives, tens of thousands have been plunged into financial insecurity, and millions of people in this city and other cities and towns have been blanketed with toxic smoke for weeks on end with unknown health consequences. Likewise, petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of people calling on the government to act on Assange's behalf have been frankly just ignored and largely censored in the media because to raise any issues about Assange could affect relations with Washington and the US-Australia military alliance. The result is that an Australian citizen and journalist has been thrown to the wolves for over 9 years and as far as Labor and the coalition are concerned, can rot and die in a prison cell. Now, we're stressing again today, as we have repeatedly at our rallies, the only force that can defeat the drive to war and the relentless assault on democratic rights is a powerful and independent movement of the working class. The SEP is committed to taking the cause of Assange, Manning, Joshua Schultz, all those persecuted for standing up for the truth. We'll take their cause deeper and deeper into the working class. We are going to intensify our patient and systematic campaign for a political rebellion by workers and young people against the collaboration of the political establishment, the trade unions and the mass media with the Trump administration. The working class has the right to know that behind the official rhetoric about democracy and serving the will of the people, governments rely on lies, xenophobic and nationalist demagogy, censorship, repression and outright criminality to serve a financial and corporate oligarchy that through financial speculation and imperialist violence has concentrated the vast bulk of the world's wealth into its hands. I won't repeat the statistics that John cited, but they are I will repeat them. The fact that several thousand billionaires on a world scale own more than 4.9 billion people. As John said, democracy is impossible with such degrees of social inequality. Over the past 4 decades, wages have been devastated, our working conditions restructured, public services decimated and privatised, and tax cuts handed out to the corporations and rich, even as they hide trillions of dollars in tax havens. The conditions, however, are transforming. What has been a one-sided war is now being a two-sided war. The working class has re-emerged. The daily reality of war, social inequality, substandard services and the attack on democratic rights and the danger of climate change have radicalised the working class and youth on a world scale. Now, at this rally, we are setting out a clear perspective. We're making a clear appeal to all those who recognise that the persecution of Assange and Manning is the spearhead of a broader assault on every hard-won democratic and social right. Turn to the working class and develop its independent initiative and struggle against the profit system and the governments that defend it. We call on workers from in every area, both union and non-union, from manufacturing and building workers, to miners and dock workers, to IT professionals, to nurses and doctors, teachers, bank workers and media professionals, to organise in defence of Assange and Manning. Form workplace committees. Take the initiative to form a committee at your workplace and move resolutions demanding the freedom of Assange and Manning and circulate it among your other sectors of your industry, as teachers are doing in Victoria and New South Wales. In every town and every suburb, we urge people to follow the example explained by Mags in Alice Springs, groups in Brisbane, groups in Darwin, groups in many, many towns and areas. Form an action group. Organise speak-outs and information stalls. Distribute material explaining the truth about Julian's case, including the letters written by doctors for Assange that have so thoroughly documented the way he has been tortured and is still being tortured. Due to the official censorship, believe me, there are people who do not know about the case of Assange and the case of Manning. In our opinion, such committees in both workplaces and in communities can become the foundation and springboard for ongoing independent political struggles over wages, over working conditions, for decent health care for the working class, for the education rights of the youth, over climate change and against militarism and the conspiracies to prepare war. Now, to conclude, Assange's legal fight, which begins on Monday in London to prevent extradition to the United States, may well be protracted. This is only stage one. If the court rules against him, his legal team will appeal, and they will appeal through the entire process of the British legal system, all the way to the highest court, as they did in 2010 against the attempt to extradite him to Sweden. Chelsea Manning's legal battle, which she was back in court this week to try to demand, presenting evidence as to why she'd be released, it also may be protracted. When this grand jury expires, they can easily just convene another one, compel her to issue a subpoena for her to appear to that, and throw her back into prison. She is confronting a situation where she is charged with no crime, but can be imprisoned indefinitely. Now, while we don't know the timetable of legal battles, we do know that the political struggle for the defence and freedom of Assange and Manning must be intensified and must be intensified now. It must draw in ever broader sections of workers and young people in this country and around the world. To all of you who recognise that the perfidious role that has been played internationally in this country by the self-styled left, Labor and trade union organisations in the persecution of Assange and Manning, those who recognise that their role and abandonment of Assange and Manning is the same as their abandonment of all other issues affecting the working class, and understand it poses the need for a new and international and socialist leadership in the working class, I conclude by urging you to consider joining the SEP and our World Party. Thank you.